orchestrated original memoir narrative, avoiding prohibited names, applying channel formula, orchestrated original memoir narrative, avoiding prohibited names, applying channel formula. The envelope was already open when I found it on my kitchen counter. The flap torn in that careless way that tells you someone didn't think twice about doing it. It was addressed to me. My name, my apartment, my future printed across the front in the bank's blue logo. And my mother-in-law was standing 6 inches away from it, holding a dish towel like she'd just been doing me a favor. "You really shouldn't keep that kind of paper lying around," she said, not even looking up. "Anybody could see it." Anybody. As if she were a stranger who'd wandered in off the street and not the woman who'd let herself into my home with the spare key my husband gave her without asking me first. I want to tell you that I said something in that moment, that I drew some kind of line in the sand right there over the granite countertop we'd financed for 18 months. But I didn't. I just picked up the envelope, slid the statement back inside like that could undo it, and said, "I'll be more careful." And she smiled at me the way you smile at a slow child who's finally caught on, and went back to wiping down a counter that was already clean. That was the beginning, or at least the part where I started paying attention. The truth is, it had been happening for years in 100 small ways I'd trained myself not to see. Let me back up. I married my husband when I was 26. We met at a wedding, which sounds romantic, and was, mostly, until I learned that his mother had also been at that wedding, watching us across the dance floor, already deciding things about me. She told me this later, years later, like it was a sweet story. "I knew the second I saw you," she said. "I knew exactly what we were dealing with." She laughed when she said it. I didn't. We didn't have much money when we started out. He was finishing his teaching credential, and I was 3 years into a job in hospital billing that paid the rent and not a dollar more. We rented a 1-bedroom on the second floor of a building that smelled like other people's dinners, and we were happy in the way you can only be happy when you don't know yet how easily it can be taken from you. His mother lived 40 minutes away in the house he'd grown up in, a widow for 9 years by then, and from the very first month, she made it clear that distance was not going to be an obstacle. She came on Sundays, then Sundays and Wednesdays, then whenever she felt like it, because by then she had the key. I should explain about the key because everyone always asks. My husband gave it to her after we'd been married about 4 months, the week I had a kidney stone and ended up in the ER overnight. She came to help. She did help, I'll give her that. She brought soup. She sat with me. She drove him to the hospital when he was too rattled to drive himself. And in the middle of all that gratitude and fear and exhaustion, he handed her a key, just in case. And nobody ever talked about taking it back. The crisis passed. The key stayed. After that, the visits stopped being visits. They became inspections. I'd come home from a 10-hour shift to find my cabinets reorganized, my spices alphabetized, my good knives moved to a drawer I didn't use because that's where knives go. Once I found a sticky note on my refrigerator that said, in her looping handwriting, "This milk expires Thursday." You're welcome. It was Tuesday. I told myself it was love. That's the thing about this kind of slow erosion. You narrate it to yourself as devotion so you don't have to feel what it actually is. She just wants to help. She's lonely. She lost her husband. She raised her son alone, and she doesn't know how to let go. All of that was true, and none of it was the whole story. The whole story was about money. It almost always is when you finally trace it back. When my husband and I had been married about 2 years, we started talking seriously about buying a house. Not a big one. We weren't dreaming above our means, just somewhere with a yard and a second bedroom, somewhere we could imagine a kid someday. We'd been saving for it the slow, honest way, a few $100s a paycheck into a high-yield account I checked on Sunday nights like other people watch their favorite show. We had almost $19,000. To us, that was a fortune. That was years of skipped vacations and packed lunches and saying no to things we wanted. I'll never forget the night we found out it was gone. Not gone, gone, but gone in the way that mattered. We were sitting at the kitchen table, going over the numbers, getting ready to talk to a lender, and my husband got quiet in a way I'd learned to be afraid of. He had a face he made when his mother was involved in something, a kind of bracing. So, about the savings, he said. It turned out that 8 months earlier, his mother had come to him with a problem. The roof on her house, the house he grew up in, needed to be replaced. $11,000. She didn't have it, she said. She was a widow on a fixed income, she said. And she couldn't possibly ask her only son's wife about it because, in her words, money is between blood. So he gave it to her. $11,000 of the 19 we'd saved together, out of the account that had both our names on it, without telling me, for 8 months. I remember the sound the refrigerator made in the silence after he finished. That hum. I remember thinking how strange it was that the kitten kept running like nothing had happened. You didn't think to ask me, I said. It wasn't a question. She's my mother. It's our money. It was an emergency. 8 months ago. It was an emergency 8 months ago, and you've sat across from me at this table every night since, and you never said a word. He had the decency to look ashamed, but underneath the shame was something worse, something I'd see again and again in the years that followed. A certainty, a bedrock belief that what he'd done was, in the end, correct, that a man takes care of his mother and a good wife understands. She said she'd pay it back, he said. She never did. We both knew even then that she never would, and the thing is, I don't think she ever intended to, because it was never really about the roof. I went and looked at her roof about a month later. I had a dentist appointment near her neighborhood, and I drove past her house on purpose, slowing down like a stalker, craning my neck. The roof looked exactly the same as it always had, same shingles. Same slightly sagging corner over the garage that had been there since before I met the family. When I asked my husband about it, he got defensive, said the work had been done in the back where I couldn't see it, said I was being paranoid, said I was looking for reasons to hate his mother. Maybe a roof had been replaced somewhere. Maybe the money had gone to something else entirely, and the roof was just the story. I never found out for sure, and that uncertainty became its own kind of poison, the way it always does. I started to see her differently after that. Every casserole she brought over, I wondered what it cost us. Every time she said, "I just want to help," I heard the cash register underneath. This is the part where I'm supposed to tell you I confronted her, that there was a big dramatic blow-up. There wasn't, not for a long time, because that's not how this works. The genius of a person like my mother-in-law is that she never gives you a clean fight. She gives you 1,000 tiny cuts, each one too small to bleed over, and if you ever try to add them up out loud, you're the crazy one, you're the dramatic one, you're the daughter-in-law who couldn't appreciate a free meal. So I did what I'd been doing. I absorbed it. I got more careful with my paperwork. I changed nothing. And the visits kept coming. The next 2 years were a kind of trench warfare I didn't even recognize as war. We did buy a house eventually, a smaller one than we'd planned, in a neighborhood a little further out than we'd hoped, with a down payment that took us another full year to rebuild because of what had been taken. And the day we got the keys, my mother-in-law cried. Real tears, I think. She walked through the empty rooms, touching the walls and saying how proud her late husband would have been. And then she said, "I'll need a key, of course, in case of emergencies." I looked at my husband. He looked at the floor. She got the key. In the new house, it got worse because now there was more house for her to manage. She rearranged the furniture in our living room while we were at work, just to show us how much better it flowed. She planted flowers in our front beds without asking. Flowers I had to water and weed for the next 3 summers because once they were in the ground, what was I going to do? Kill them? She came over on a Saturday and replaced the shower curtain in our guest bathroom because mine was a little juvenile. And I want to be fair because the channel my life eventually turned into is full of people who think the answer is just to hate the mother in law. And that was never quite where I landed. She wasn't a monster. She was a woman who'd built her entire identity around being needed, and her son had married someone who threatened that, and she fought the only war she knew how to fight. She fought it through control, through money, through keys and shower curtains and casseroles. She was, in her own broken way, terrified of being left behind. I might have made my peace with all of it, slowly the way people do if it had stayed about furniture and flowers. But then I got pregnant. We'd been trying for almost a year, and when the test finally came back positive, I cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes. The good kind of crying. And then I called my husband at work, and he left in the middle of a faculty meeting and drove home, and we sat on the kitchen floor of our too small house, holding each other and laughing. It was, I think, the last truly uncomplicated happiness of that whole era of my life. Because my husband, in his joy, called his mother before we'd even talked about who to tell. She was at our house within the hour, and from the moment she walked through the door, the baby stopped being ours. It became hers. I don't know how to explain to people who haven't lived it. She didn't say it in words. She'd never be so clumsy. But everything in her behavior shifted. The pregnancy was a project she was now in charge of. She had opinions about my doctor, my diet, my stress levels, which she monitored and reported on to my husband like a foreman. She bought a crib, a whole crib, assembled, delivered, set up in the second bedroom while we were out, before I'd even decided what I wanted the nursery to look like. When I came home and saw it there, this enormous mahogany thing that cost more than our monthly grocery budget and that I'd had no part in choosing, I felt something crack in me that hadn't cracked before. Because I understood, finally, what she was doing. She was buying her way into the center of my child's life, the same way she'd bought her way into ours. And she had decided, somewhere in that mind of hers, that this baby would be the thing that finally made me unnecessary. The financial stuff escalated with the baby in a way that should have been a relief, and instead made everything worse. She started giving us money, not loans this time, gifts, a check for the crib I hadn't wanted, a check for the hospital costs, which insurance largely covered. A check once that I found tucked into a baby blanket she'd left on our porch for $2,000 with a note that said, "For the things you can't afford." For the things you can't afford. My husband saw generosity. I saw a leash. Because money like that always comes with a string. And the string was this. Every dollar she gave us was a dollar of say. Every gift was a vote. She was building a case, quietly, that we couldn't manage without her, and the more we accepted, the truer it became. I started saying no to the money, quietly at first. I'd tear up the checks before my husband saw them. When he found out, we had our worst fight yet, in the nursery, in whispers because the baby was finally sleeping. He said I was throwing away help we needed out of pride. He wasn't entirely wrong about the needing. We were stretched thin. A new baby, a single income for a few months while I was out, a mortgage. The money would have made things easier. But I looked at him over our sleeping daughter's crib and I said the truest thing I'd said in years. If we take her money, we will never be free of her. Not ever. Not for the rest of our lives. She will own a piece of every decision we make about this child until the day she dies. Is that what you want for our daughter? And for the first time, something in his face shifted, just slightly, a door opening a crack. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Because the next morning, his mother showed up with a car seat she'd installed in her own car, her car, so she could help with pickups and appointments. and it hit me that she was preparing, in her methodical way, to make herself the third parent of my child. The senior parent, really? The one with the money and the experience and the key to our house, and now a baby seat in her car? I want to tell you about the night everything changed, because it didn't happen the way I'd always imagined it would. There was no screaming match, no suitcase by the door. The channel I eventually started, the one where I tell these stories, it's called When Peace Blinks Quietly, and I named it that for a reason. Because in my experience, the real turning points don't come with thunder. They come in a kitchen at 2 in the morning when nobody's watching. My daughter was about 4 months old. She had colic, the kind that doesn't care about your sleep or your sanity, and I was up with her every night, walking the same loop through the dark house, bouncing and shushing and praying. And on this particular night, somewhere around 2, I was standing at the kitchen window with her finally drifting off against my shoulder, and I looked out at the driveway and I saw my mother-in-law's car parked across the street, lights off, just sitting there. I want you to understand what that did to me. It was not a coincidence. She lived 40 minutes away. There was no reason for her to be on my street at 2 in the morning except that she was watching my windows. Maybe watching for the light I always had on during the night feedings. Maybe just sitting there in the dark, feeling like she was part of it, part of the late-night intimacy of a newborn that she had no right to. I stood very still. The baby breathed against my neck, and something in me, after years of absorbing and excusing and narrating it all as love, finally went quiet and cold and certain. I didn't go out there. I didn't wake my husband. I just stood at the window holding my daughter, and I watched until, after maybe 20 minutes, her headlights came on and she drove away. And I knew, with a clarity I'd never had before, exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, I told my husband what I'd seen. I expected him to defend her. I'd braced for it, but he didn't. He went pale and he sat down at the table and he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, in a small voice I hadn't heard from him before, "That's not okay." "No," I said, "it's not. I don't know how to fix this," he said. "She's my mother." And here is the thing I'd learned, the thing that became the whole spine of every story I'd ever tell afterward. I said to him, "You don't have to fix her. You can't. She is who she is, and she's not going to change at 63. But you can fix what we let her do. Those are different things." We changed the locks that week. It sounds so small when I say it like that. We changed the locks. But it was the hardest thing either of us had ever done. Harder than the wedding, harder than the mortgage, harder than the colic. Because changing the locks meant taking back the key. And taking back the key meant a conversation neither of us wanted to have. My husband insisted on doing it himself. I'll give him credit for that, because by then he understood it had to come from him, that if it came from me, it would just become more proof that I was the villain who'd turned her son against her. He drove out to her house on a Sunday alone, and he sat in her kitchen, the kitchen he'd grown up in, and he told her that we loved her and we wanted her in our daughter's life and that things were going to be different now, that she'd need to call before coming over, that she didn't have a key to our house anymore, that the money had to stop, that she was the grandmother, and the grandmother is a wonderful and important thing to be. But it is not the parent, and the parents had to be allowed to parent. He told me later that she cried, that she said cruel things, that she told him I had poisoned him, that I'd planned this from the beginning, that she'd known the second she saw me at that wedding what kind of woman I was. And then, when the crying and the cruelty didn't work, she went silent, stone silent, and she didn't speak to either of us for 4 months. Those 4 months were the hardest and the best of my marriage. Hardest, because the silence was its own weapon, and it worked on my husband. He grieved her like she'd died. He second-guessed himself constantly. He'd pick up his phone to call her and then put it down. Some nights I'd find him sitting in the dark and I knew where his mind was. The guilt of a son who's drawn a line with his mother is a specific kind of pain, and I couldn't take it from him. I could only sit beside him in it. But they were the best months too, because for the first time in our entire marriage, our home was ours. I'd come home from work, and the spices were where I left them. The flowers in the beds were ones I'd chosen. The furniture stayed where we put it. My daughter slept in a nursery I decorated with my own hands, and the only people who touched her were the people who were supposed to. The house got quiet in a way I hadn't known it could be. Not empty quiet, peaceful quiet, the peace you only get when you stop bracing for the next intrusion. I started sleeping better. I didn't even realize until it lifted how much of my body had been clenched for years waiting. She came back, eventually, the way these things go. She called on my husband's birthday. The conversation was stiff and short, and she didn't apologize, because women like her never apologize. Apology is a kind of surrender they're constitutionally incapable of. But she called, and then she called again, and slowly, over months, we built something new, something with rules. She calls before she comes over now, every time. She rings the doorbell at her own son's house and waits to be let in, and I know how much that costs her, and some small, ungenerous part of me is glad it costs her something. She doesn't reorganize my kitchen. She brings gifts for my daughter. Normal grandmother gifts, books and little dresses, and when she occasionally tries to slip an envelope of cash into my hand at the door, I hand it back, gently, every single time, and I say, "We're okay. Thank you, but we're okay." And she stopped fighting me on it mostly. She's learned that the money doesn't buy what it used to. It is not a warm relationship. I want to be honest about that, because the stories people like best are the ones that end with everyone hugging and crying and learning that family is everything. That's not my story. My mother-in-law and I will never be close. There's too much history, too much taken and never given back. Too much of that night I stood at the window watching her car. We are polite. We are functional. We share a love for the same little girl, and that love is real on both sides, and it's enough to build a working peace on, and it is not enough to build a friendship. And I've made my peace with that too, because somewhere along the way I figured out that I didn't need her to love me. I needed her to respect the borders of my life. Those are different things, and the second one turned out to be the only one I could actually negotiate for. My daughter is 6 now. She adores her grandmother in the simple way children adore anyone who shows up with presence and patience, and I would never take that from her. I watch them sometimes, the two of them on the living room floor doing a puzzle, and I feel something complicated and warm. Because the thing I protected in the end wasn't my house or my money or even my marriage, though all of those got protected too. The thing I protected was my daughter's right to have a grandmother who loves her without owning her. A grandmother she can adore freely because the adults around her did the hard, ugly, quiet work of building fences before she was old enough to need them. I think about the $11,000 sometimes. We never got it back. We never will. For a long time, I was bitter about it. That money we'd bled ourselves dry to save, gone in an afternoon to a roof that may or may not have existed. But I've come to think of it differently now. I think of it as tuition, the most expensive lesson I ever paid for, and the most valuable. Because it taught me, years before I had the language for it, that generosity with strings isn't generosity. That a gift you can't refuse isn't a gift, it's a purchase. And that the most loving thing you can sometimes do for your own family is to close a door that everyone around you is telling you to keep open. People write to me now. That's the strange afterlife this whole thing took on. I started talking about it, first to a friend, then to a small group, then to anyone who'd listen, because I'd spent so many years thinking I was the only one, the crazy, dramatic daughter-in-law, and it turned out there were thousands of us. tens of thousands, living in houses that weren't quite their own, bracing every time a key turned in the lock, narrating their slow erosion as love because the alternative was too lonely to face. They ask me how I did it, how I found the strength, and I always tell them the same thing, which is that it wasn't strength, not the kind they imagine. It wasn't a brave speech or a slammed door. It was a woman standing at a kitchen window at 2 in the morning with a sleeping baby on her shoulder, finally letting herself see what was right in front of her. The strength was just in the seeing. Everything after that, the locks, the conversation, the 4 months of silence, all of it just followed from the seeing, the way water follows the shape of the ground. The peace I have now is not the peace I imagined when I was 26 and newly married and certain that love would be enough. It's quieter than that, smaller. It has rules and limits and a polite distance built into it. But it's mine. It's the first thing in my adult life that's been fully, unmistakably mine. And I built it not with a fight, but with a fence. And I'd do it all again. Sometimes my daughter asks me why Grandma always rings the doorbell instead of just coming in like she does at her friends' houses, and I tell her that it's because this is our home, and in our home, people knock. And she nods, the way kids do when they accept a thing without fully understanding it, and she runs off to answer the door. And I stand in my kitchen, in the quiet, in the peace I made, and I let her go. For years, I told myself that what Gloria did was love, because love was the only word that let me keep absorbing it. The reorganized cabinets, the $11,000 that vanished into a roof I could never quite confirm existed, the key she carried to a home that was supposed to be mine. I narrated all of it as devotion, and that narration cost me more than the money ever did. It cost me years of clenched sleep and a marriage that bent quietly under a weight neither Bennett nor I would name. What I learned standing at that window with Maeve breathing against my neck is that nothing in our lives happens by accident. Gloria didn't take control because she was evil. She took it because we left every door open and called the open door respect. Every key we handed over, every check we cashed, every silence we kept was a small permission, and permissions add up the way water carves stone. The car parked across the street at 2 in the morning wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the harvest of seeds we planted ourselves. If I could sit with the younger version of me, the one crying in the bathroom over a positive test, I tell her 3 things, and they're the same 3 I try to give Maeve now without ever lecturing her about them. The first is that being a good person and being a doormat are not the same, and the day you confuse kindness with the inability to say no is the day people stop respecting either. Clean boundaries are not cruelty, they are the most honest form of love there is. The second is to look at what's actually in front of you instead of the story you've decided to tell about it. For years, I had every piece of evidence I needed and I rearranged the facts to spare myself the conclusion. The night I finally let myself see the car for what it was, that was the only real turning point, and it didn't require strength yet. It required clear eyes. Everything afterward followed from the seeing the way water follows the slope of the ground. The third is that knowing the right thing changes nothing until you do the hard, ugly, frightening thing it asks of you. Changing the locks. Taking back the key. Sitting beside Bennett through 4 months of his mother's silence while he grieved a woman who wasn't dead. That part wasn't insight. That part was just endurance, the willingness to stay standing in the discomfort long enough for a new shape to set. I don't have a warm relationship with Gloria, and I've stopped pretending I need one. What I have is a home where people knock, a daughter who adores her grandmother freely because the fences were built before she was old enough to need them, and a quiet I earned the only way real quiet is ever earned, not by winning a fight, by finally refusing to keep losing one.